My name is Mandeep Kaur Messina. I am a second-generation immigrant, and I live and work and play on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Lekwungen peoples, who are the Wasanich, Songhees, and Esquimalt nations of what most folks know as Victoria, British Columbia. And I have the wonderful privilege of opening up the space and this amazing circle and the forum that we will be talking and engaging in today. Our research team is situated in two major parts of this nation. In the University of Victoria here is on Lekwungen territories, and I also would like to acknowledge my partners, my research partners, who are located on the traditional Treaty 13 territories, which is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And in making this acknowledge, we want to acknowledge that the communities in both these spaces and all the spaces in which you're joining us from continue and remain resilient in the face of historical and ongoing colonial violence. We make this acknowledgement by committing to everyday practices to uphold Indigenous self-determination and to engage in ongoing reflection on how our research and practices ally with Indigenous nations across this land. And I do this with great humility and respect for all the communities that are actively involved in this work. So before we start, and I pass over the mic to my co-conspirators in this work, I would like to thank our collaborators, our amazing research team. There's a great deal of volunteers and folks who are on our advisory committee that make wonderful, meaningful contributions and have made this forum possible for you all today. It's amazing to see how many people are taking part in the conversation, which goes to show that this is an incredibly important space, time, and conversation to be had. I have the privilege of handing over the reins to Rupalim, my wonderful colleague, mentor, and co-conspirator, part of the research team.
As Mandeep was saying, I'm Rupalim Bhuyan. I teach at the University of Toronto, the lands of the Mississauga, the Credit, the Haudenosaunee. I'm here at Wendat, Seneca. I'm very grateful to live and work and play as well on this territory, and to continue the process of learning and unlearning, of a sense of responsibility to territory and people in solidarity with Indigenous communities, which is particularly salient since today we're talking about migration and the way the state regulates people through the legal status of immigration, and how that plays a role in the ways they support themselves and their families, and at times when they become involved in the child welfare system. So my role today is to give you a brief overview of the project and also outline some key terms so we can have some shared language, and also invite you all to bring your own knowledge, as many of you have direct experience working and supporting immigrants, or yourself as an immigrant, perhaps involved in different systems, including the child welfare system. So the boarding project overview, Mandeep already gave a shout out, our thanks to the many people involved. It was great. We got to meet with all the facilitators. The screen was full. We have incredible speakers and folks facilitating workshops. I'm not going to read all of their names, but I just want to give special thanks to Bilkiz, who's been supporting the event organization, and then behind the scenes today working Yasmin and Abigail are folks helping with the tech support. And of course, many folks who are involved in our research advisory committee as well, some of whom will be playing different roles during the reflection period later, as well as on our panel. So as an overview, just in terms of background, many of us involved in the research have been looking at how precarious immigration status shapes the lives of immigrants, but also the way we support people in the different service delivery spaces. I teach and train social work, and my background is in gender-based violence. So we wanted to invite us to pay attention to, and I'll give some information about the growth in precarious immigration status in Canada, to provide some language, shared language around systemic racism with an intersectional lens. In the wake of the pandemic and all of the uprisings that took place, I should say the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, there became much more public discourse around systemic racism, but I often wonder if we're saying the same thing. So we're going to offer some working definitions and also tie it into our bordering language that we're bringing as an everyday practice. So we'll say a little bit more about what that looks like. One of the overarching goals of the research is to understand how immigration status and systemic racism in concert shape the process of assessing risk for child abuse or neglect for racialized immigrants in Canada. So in terms of some of the operating, I'm putting in a glossary, but these are working definitions. You know, the United Nations and various international organizations will recognize a migrant as any person who changes their country of residence. So it's a very broad definition, irrespective of the reason for migration or their status in the country where they're residing. The term immigrant also has different meanings depending on context. We're using a broad definition here to refer to people who are permanently settling in a country where they've migrated to. They may or may not have the immigrant status legally. So immigration status here, we're really referring to that legal relationship with the state, in this case, Canada, which, as Mandeep was saying, is a settler colonial project. How this immigration status then authorizes both the conditions of entering Canada, remaining in Canada, but also a range of entitlements or rights or access to services. This could include people who are visitors, temporary residents who are studying or working or seeking asylum, permanent residents, as well as citizens, people who have come to Canada and then made their way to citizenship. Many of us, I'm sure if we did a raise of hands, would be in one of those categories, myself included. We also recognize there are many folks who do not have a current legal status, often referred to as non-status or undocumented in Canada. There are many ways to become undocumented, so I can't speak to all of them, but because of its geographic isolation, most people in Canada who don't have a current status came here on some form of temporary status and either overstayed their visa or were unable to maintain their visa because of bureaucratic hurdles or other conditions, economic precarity, and were not provided a path to permanent residence that was feasible. So permanent residence is often the category of immigrant people have in mind. The history of Canada throughout the post-1970s, many people entering had permanent residence. These are people who were granted permanent residence either on arrival or after arriving and living in Canada. Today, more than half of the people who are granted permanent residence have already been in Canada. And this speaks to Canada's preference for people who've already established themselves and have demonstrated some language fluency in English or French and some employability on the job market. So when we see permanent residents today, we're seeing a lot of folks who've already been living in Canada, but didn't have settlement services because they were not eligible for them when they were temporary. And then finally, the concept newcomer. This is a very Canadian concept. It has kind of a strong affinity, the sense of welcoming. It often refers to people who are immigrants or refugees who more recently arrived in Canada, and is often also tied to funding eligibility within 5 years. So these terms mean different things in different contexts. So we invite you again through the discussions to consider what they look like in your spaces. Just in terms of a snapshot, this is from the last data we have from the Canadian Census. There is upwards of 1 in 5 people living in Canada today who migrated to Canada and settled here during their lifetime. This is a huge diversity of origin, so upward to 200 places of birth are included. So there is a great heterogeneity in immigrants. But today, when we talk about immigration, the vast majority are coming from countries in Asia, increasingly from countries in Africa, as well as the Caribbean and South America. So somewhere upwards of 90% are going to be racialized as minorities after coming to Canada. So the shift in migration has really turned to a change in the demographics of Canada, and also the kind of challenges of talking about immigration as a racial project, since most immigrants today are also going to be racialized as minorities. The concept of precarious status, we're turning to the work of many different folks, including Lewin Goldring, who's at York University, and colleagues. It really is a way of thinking about the ways many of these statuses are lacking basic rights and privileges that are associated with Canadian citizenship. So when we say precarious status, we are often talking about the absence of one or more of the following. So either the absence of the right to work or work authorization, or having your right to work tied to a specific employer. It's the not having the right to remain permanently in Canada, even if it is your wish to do so, even if you've been living here for 10 years or more. Not having the same social and political rights available to permanent residents and citizens. This could include accessing income assistance. When the Canadian benefit came, the emergency benefit came, being able to access that CRBE, as well as not being dependent on a third party for your right to remain in Canada, again, an employer or a sponsor. And then because precarious status now extends to people with permanent residence, so those who have a criminal charge and a sentence of 6 months or more are also vulnerable of losing their status. So even permanent residence is not permanent and can carry the potential to be detained or deported. So we want to keep these in mind as overarching concepts. And finally, a last few words about the way we're thinking about racism today. This is a very broad definition, and I think it's important to think expansively and how long these concepts have endured. Here we're looking at the Puerto Rican scholar Ramon Rosfuguel. He writes that racism is a global hierarchy of human superiority and inferiority, politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries. It's often embedded in institutions associated with the capitalist patriarchal state, Western-centric, Christian-centric societies, modern colonial world systems, and often is intertwined with different ways that superiority is marked. So it could be skin color or physical attributes, it could be ethnicity, language, culture, or religion. And I'm sure you can imagine examples of this in your own workspaces. When we think of systemic racism, we're also thinking about this broad base of involvement of whole systems, or often all systems, for example, political, legal, economic, healthcare, school, criminal justice, and today adding child welfare as well as the structures that uphold this. Part of what's so difficult about systemic racism, if it is everywhere, how do we then distinguish what we can do to disrupt the racist effects? And so this is part of the journey for today as well. And then finally, the concept of bordering, because of our thinking about the nation as not this taken for granted thing, as we were talking about Indigenous struggles for sovereignty contest the legitimacy of the Canadian nation. So similarly, we want us to keep in mind the nation state as a continual process of colonial racial ordering. It's spatial, it's social, it's temporal. I think of this of where my family is from in the state of Assam, which is currently part of India, also a colonial project that's in the making and is under contestation. As Harsha Walia, incredible activist, migrant activist, has said, the border is less about a politics of movement and more understood as a method of organizing people, organizing territory, organizing labor. We see this in the Human Rights Tribunal that just took place this week in Ontario, reviewing case of migrant workers who are racially profiled by the police. We see this in perhaps the day-to-day circumstances of who we admit into our services or exclude based on their immigration status. And so everyday bordering, we think of it, those processes that regulate or constrain professional decision-making. It can be grounded in implicit or explicit considerations of who belongs. So this is the overarching framework I invite you to keep in mind and invite you to add to in our discussions as we continue. I'm going to move quickly through some of our key questions. We're going to be asking the panelists to respond to how does processes of risk reproduce internal borders? What forms of everyday bordering do they see and how do they relate to systemic racism? And what are the ways immigration status shapes involvement in the child welfare system? In terms of our research project, just very quickly again, we've been doing, taking stock of the current research that's been done in social work with immigrants in Canada. Something what we found is in the last 10 years, though a lot has been written about immigrant adaptation and acculturation, very few research articles actually pay attention to immigration status. We see the absence of immigration status also in our review of policies at the provincial level, both in Ontario and British Columbia. The child welfare policies and guidelines sometimes don't even mention the word immigrant anywhere in the documents. So we're trying to understand, what does this absence mean, and what kind of guidance is necessary to provide support for immigrant families. So in future, we will be doing more research, talking to folks in individual and group interviews, folks working in the child welfare system, as well as folks supporting families who are involved in the child welfare system. Okay, so that's it for me. And now I get to talk about the forum. We'll be inviting folks to share and dialogue across their different spaces to identify issues and gaps and lessons, and invite exchange of knowledge